So we were talking, one way that I thought of going into this whole discussion of post-colonial thought and reflection, and also decolonial thought, was to look at how the personal impacts what you think and how you see the world. And so if I take my own experience as a person who was brought up by my mother, when my mother met my father, she was in her 20s and very young, like most people, and came to Denmark on a trip. I think she was heading to Sweden, and she decided that she wanted to stay in Denmark. And my father and her, anyway, they decided that they would get married and she would meet my grandmother. Now, my grandmother has probably been the most important person in my life in Denmark, because she was with me throughout all my time. I cannot remember a time when I did not depend on her when she was alive. And from a very young age, and you would imagine that I hadn't grown up in Denmark, so I lived in Paris, and then we moved to France, and then we moved to Jamaica. And I grew up, most of my childhood was in Jamaica with with my mother's family. The thing which is something that we're not addressing here in Denmark is that Denmark is culturally very, it's not very easy in regards to dealing with issues of cultural nature. And that's partly because it really has never really opened itself up to it. And that was one of the things I loved with my grandmother, was that she was an extremely open person, to the point where it was also she could reveal herself. But I think these things can be a good thing in that sense, because I think that is where it has to go. It has to go to the point where people are willing to be a bit vulnerable and are willing to see the world through other people's eyes, instead of imagining that they know everything from the position they stand. And this is something that many people haven't really understood when we talk about these issues, is that you really have to start listening to other people and their point of view, because you cannot step into their feet, and they themselves are the only ones who can speak from their voices and their thoughts and their ideas. And it's important that you listen. And I think this is one of the biggest problems probably in Denmark, is that most people imagine that I really believe there is this kind of over-exaggerated self-ego that says that that everyone's allowed to do whatever, and they're allowed to think whatever, and that sounds fine, and I totally agree with free spirit and be open. I'm totally into that. But I think also that you cannot see the world through your own perspective only, that you have to listen to others, and that perspective is what grows you as an individual and as a person. So back to my grandmother. So when my grandmother met my mother for the first time, she had never met a black person, I don't think, before then. And so you have to imagine what it was like at that time in 60s, right? It's in the late 60s, where she was understanding any ideas of cultures or blackness or identity was coming from the Congo, some of it. Some of it was coming from the from St. Croix or the West Indies. And so the way that the narrative that was being shaped by people who were mostly Danes who were shaping this narrative. And that narrative was basically saying, it was like mercenaries who had been sent to the Congo to, under King Leopold, who, was very brutal in his way of dealing with the Congolese people. So it wasn't exactly, it was violent times there. And so if you think of these kinds of reflections, then you have to think about what kind of picture were being the image or the dominance or the power, and how that structure was being aligned and looked upon. And so my Danish grandmother imagined that my grandmother would be, I don't know what she imagined, but she never said that. But she basically, she didn't know what to expect. And when she met my grandmother, she told me, she was like totally like, my grandmother was like the classist. She had a lot of class and she was damn snappy. So, my grandmother in that comparison was definitely frumpy compared to my grandmother Mormor, who was quite exquisite. But the point is that you can't go on imagining that. So when you have a movement such as Black Lives Matter happening around you, you must understand that this too comes from somewhere. The problem is that most people aren't prepared for it. Denmark is still extremely much of a boony land when it comes to understanding this, and this is the problem.